What a delightful evening.
Indeed.
She arrived at the Ashworth ball in a dress that had been mended so many times, the thread colours no longer matched. They saw her the moment she walked in. Lady Cordelia Finch-Morrow, all powder and pearls and perfectly positioned cruelty, leaned toward her circle and said something behind her fan. The laughter that followed was not quiet. It was not meant to be. The girl at the door heard every word. She stood in the entrance of the most important ballroom in London, in her mismatched dress and her worn-down shoes, and she did not flinch, and she did not leave. And the particular way she held her chin, not high with arrogance, but level, the way a person holds it when they have survived things these women could not imagine, that should have been the first warning. No one took it. Her name was Iseldra Voss. She had come to this ball with nothing. No title, no fortune, no family name worth speaking in polite company. By morning, she would be a duchess. And every person in that room who had laughed behind their fan would spend the rest of the season trying to understand how a girl they had dismissed in an evening had become someone they could never again afford to ignore. But here is the thing none of them ever found out. Iseldra had not become a duchess by accident. If you love a story about a woman who lets them underestimate her and then makes them remember it forever, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe, because Chapter 1 starts now, and I promise you, the first thing Iseldra does will change everything you think this story is about. Iseldra Voss had been repairing that dress for 6 years. She knew every seam of it, every place where the fabric had thinned to near transparency and needed reinforcing. Every section of hem she had let down and taken up again as the years required. It had been her mother's once a pale gold silk that had seen better decades, cut in a style that was not quite fashionable, but was not quite unfashionable either, which was the best she could hope for. She had pressed it the night before with a flat iron borrowed from Mrs. Pelham downstairs, and in the narrow mirror of her rented room on Cutter's Lane, she had looked at herself for a long time before deciding that she looked well enough. Well enough was not a phrase the women of Mayfair used. But Iseldra had learned to work with what she had, and what she had tonight was a pressed dress, clean hair, and an invitation that no one was supposed to know she had received. The invitation had come 4 days ago. No name on the envelope, just her address written in a hand. She did not recognize a clean, deliberate hand, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to writing things that mattered. Inside was a single card, the Ashworth crest pressed into the top, the words written beneath it in the same careful hand, "You are expected, come alone." She had turned it over. She had looked for a signature. There was none. She had told no one. Not her landlady, not Mrs. Pelham, not the only person in London she might have called a friend, a woman named Sunniva Crane, who sold ribbon at a market stall near the Strand, and who would have told her, with great affection and complete practicality, that unattributed invitations from the homes of dukes were traps, and that Iseldra should put the card in the fire and think no more about it. Sunniva was not wrong about most things, but Iseldra had looked at the card for 4 days, and something in her, something specific and quiet and not given to recklessness, had said that this was not a trap, or, if it was a trap, it was the kind worth walking into with eyes open. She had walked in. The Ashworth house was on Grosvenor Square, which meant that the moment her hired cab turned the corner, she was visible to the footman at the door, to the guests arriving in their polished carriages, to the small gathering of people on the pavement who were waiting for various things, and who noticed, as people notice, the difference between someone who arrived in the right kind of conveyance and someone who did not. She paid the cab driver the exact amount, which left her with very little in her purse, and walked to the door. She gave her name. The footman checked a list. His expression when he found it, there was exactly the expression of a man who has encountered something inconsistent with his understanding of how the world works, but who is paid to be impassive about such inconsistencies. "Miss Voss," he said, and opened the door. She walked into the entrance hall, and then, because the doors to the ballroom were already open and there was nowhere to pause and collect herself, she walked into that too. She heard the laughter almost immediately. She had been in the entrance of the ballroom for perhaps 4 seconds before Cordelia Finch-Morrow, standing in a circle of women who were wearing the combined economic output of several small counties, leaned toward her nearest companion and said something that ended in Iseldra's direction and produced precisely the response Cordelia had designed it for. Iseldra kept her chin level. She had learned to do that very young. Her father had been a gentleman of modest means, who had spent his modest means immodestly and died when she was 11, leaving her mother with a house that was shortly no longer theirs, and a social position that evaporated with the furniture. Her mother had died 4 years later of the particular combination of cold and disappointment and insufficient food that poverty dressed up as illness. Iseldra had been 15. She had organized the burial herself, with the help of a clergyman who had been kind and a neighbour who had not, and she had stood at the graveside in the November rain and understood, with the clarity of a person who has run out of alternatives, that no one was coming to help her. Since then, she had existed in the space that London created for women of her particular circumstance, too well born for certain kinds of work, too poor for the society her birth technically permitted her to claim. She had done needlework for pay. She had read aloud to an elderly woman in Bloomsbury for 3 years until the woman died and left her library to a nephew who had no use for Iseldra. She had tutored the children of families who could not quite afford a proper governess, and so settled for someone like her, and who treated her accordingly, not cruelly, for the most part, but with the specific thoughtlessness of people who do not consider the feelings of those they consider below them worth the effort of consideration. She was 22 now. She was not stupid about her situation. She knew what the options were for women in her position, and she had arranged her life around preserving the two things. She still had her independence and her clarity, because everything else could be rebuilt if those two remained. She moved through the edge of the ballroom with quiet purpose, looking for whoever had sent the invitation, which meant looking for someone who expected her specifically. The room was full, the kind of full that absorbed sound and reflected it back as noise, voices, music, the particular restless energy of people performing their own importance at each other. Crystal chandeliers burned above it all. The flowers on the mantelpieces cost more than her monthly rent. She felt a touch at her elbow. She turned. The woman beside her was perhaps 60, small and very upright, dressed in deep grey with no ornamentation except a single cameo at her throat. Her face was not soft, but was not unkind. Her eyes were the steady, appraising kind that had seen a great many things and had stopped being surprised by most of them. "Miss Voss," the woman said, "I am Evanthea Beaumont. I believe you received my letter." Iseldra looked at her. "The invitation was yours." "The invitation was mine," she said it, with the simplicity of a woman who does not waste words on hedging. "Walk with me. We cannot speak adequately here." They moved together toward the far end of the room, past a set of curtained doors that opened onto a narrow corridor, and through that into a smaller room, a sitting room, clearly used as a retreat from the main event, currently empty. Evanthea Beaumont closed the door behind them and turned with the unhurried competence of a woman who had arranged this precisely. "You don't know me," Evanthea said. "No," Iseldra said. "You know the name Beaumont." It was not a question, but Iseldra answered it anyway. "The Duke of Ashworth's family name. My nephew is the Duke of Ashworth." Evanthea sat, not as an invitation for Iseldra to sit, but simply because she was 60 and had been standing long enough. "He does not know you are here. He does not know I invited you." A pause. "He does not in fact know that I have spent the last 4 months looking for you specifically." The room was quiet enough that Iseldra could hear the music from the ballroom, thin and remote through the closed door. She kept her face still. "Why?" she said. Evanthea looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes. "Because your mother was Philippa Caro before she married, and Philippa Caro was the natural daughter of my father. She let the sentence sit. Which makes you my great niece, which makes you, by blood, if not by the record that was never properly kept, a Beaumont." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Iseldra stood very still in the sitting room of the Ashworth house on Grosvenor Square, and felt the shape of what she had just been told move through her the way cold water moves slowly, reaching everything. She was not a woman given to immediate reaction. She had spent years training herself not to react immediately to difficult information, because immediate reactions were a luxury that people without safety nets could not afford. She said, "My mother never spoke of it." She wouldn't have. Something crossed Evanthea's face. Not guilt exactly, but the long-settled residue of it. "My father was not a good man in the particular way that powerful men are sometimes not good. Your grandmother was a woman of no standing who had no means of compelling him to acknowledge what he had done. He didn't. Your mother grew up knowing who her father was and knowing he had chosen not to know her, which is a particular kind of damage that tends to make a person quiet on the subject." Iseldra thought about her mother, about the specific quality of her mother's silences, which had been numerous, and which Iseldra had always attributed to grief and poverty and the general weight of a difficult life. She thought about a woman who had known her own father, had looked away and said nothing to her daughter, because what was there to say? What words covered that? "Why now?" Iseldra said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "Because I am old, and I have done my share of looking away, and I have recently decided that the cost of it is higher than I allowed myself to calculate." Evanthea's hands were folded in her lap with a composure that was genuine and earned. "And because my nephew is in a situation that you, specifically, may be of some use in addressing," she paused. "If you are willing." There it was. Iseldra had been waiting for that. She had known, with the practical instinct of someone who had lived on the careful side of other people's motivations for years, that generosity of this kind did not arrive without a shape to it. She did not hold it against the woman. She simply needed to understand the full dimension of what was being offered and what was being asked before she decided anything. "Tell me about the Duke," she said. Evanthea looked at her with something that might have been the earliest edge of approval. "His name is Aldrich. He is 31. He is difficult in the way that intelligent men with too much authority and insufficient opposition tend to be. He was engaged to be married until 6 weeks ago, when the engagement was broken by the young woman's family on grounds that were not made public, but that I know to be manufactured." She paused. Someone wanted that engagement ended. Someone with enough influence over the Pembridge family to make them act against their own financial interest. "And you want to know who?" Iseldra said. "I want Aldrich protected," Evanthea said, from whatever is being arranged around him that he is too proud and too certain of his own judgment to see coming. She looked at Iseldra directly. You have spent 22 years watching how the world operates from the outside of it. That is an education that no drawing room in London can replicate. I need someone close enough to him to see what I cannot see from a distance. Iseldra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and in exchange, your mother's connection to this family, properly documented, a legitimate place in this world, enough means to live as you should have always lived. Evanthea met her eyes. And the truth, which I think you are owed regardless of anything else. The music from the ballroom drifted under the door, unchanged and indifferent. Iseldra thought about Cutter's Lane, and the borrowed flatiron, and the dress with the mismatched thread. She thought about her mother standing at a window. She never talked about what she was looking for through it. She thought about the laughter that had met her at the ballroom door 20 minutes ago, and the particular sound of it, which had been designed to diminish and had not succeeded, but which had also not missed entirely. She thought about the invitation. You are expected. She said, I want to meet him before I decide. Evanthea nodded, as though this was the answer she had been waiting for. He is in the card room, she said. He goes there when the ballroom becomes unbearable to him, which is usually within the first hour. She stood. Come. She led Iseldra back through the corridor, past the curtained doors, into a side passage that connected to a quieter part of the house. They stopped outside a closed door. Inside, Iseldra could hear the low sound of male voices, the soft sound of cards on a table. He will not be expecting you, Evanthea said quietly. He will be dismissive initially. He is always dismissive initially. Do not let it touch you. People have been dismissive of me for 10 years, Iseldra said. I have developed a considerable tolerance. Something moved in Evanthea's face that was real and warm and brief. Good, she said, and opened the door. There were 4 men at the card table. 3 of them looked up with varying degrees of interest. The 4th did not look up immediately, which told her he was either very absorbed in his hand or very accustomed to people entering rooms and waiting for his attention. When he did look up, she understood immediately that it was the latter. Aldrich Beaumont, 5th Duke of Ashworth, was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared for something along the lines of what wealth and entitlement usually produced in Regency England, a man who wore his authority the way he wore his tailoring, visibly, and with the expectation that others would notice and adjust themselves accordingly. She had prepared for someone handsome in the manner of people who have never had cause to develop anything beyond their surface. He was handsome, yes, but it was the secondary thing. The primary thing was his eyes, which were dark and very direct, and were now on her with an attention so immediate and complete that it felt like being assessed rather than looked at, which was unusual. Because most men of his station looked at women like her and saw only the category she fell into, not the particular person inside it. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at his aunt. Evanthea, he said, and his voice was low and quite dry. Who is this? Someone you need to meet, Evanthea said, with the serenity of a woman who has already won and is simply waiting for the board to catch up. He looked back at Iseldra. She looked back at him. She kept her chin exactly level. His expression did not change, but something behind it did some minor internal adjustment, barely visible, the kind made by a man encountering something that does not fit his existing categories, and who is, despite himself, interested in what category it actually belongs to. He set his cards face down on the table. Clear the room, he said to the other 3 men, without looking at them. They went. Of course they went. Iseldra stood in the emptied card room of the Ashworth house and looked at the man who did not yet know that his aunt had spent 4 months engineering this moment, and that everything he understood about his own situation was about to become considerably more complicated. He did not know any of that yet. But he would, she thought, soon. And the question that she carried out of that room later, the question that sat with her in the hired cab back to Cutter's Lane, that followed her up the narrow stairs to her room, that was still there when she lay in the dark looking at the ceiling, was not whether to accept Evanthea's proposal. She had already decided that, in the corridor. The question was this: the broken engagement, the manufactured grounds, the invisible hand that had moved the Pembridge family against their own interests. Whose hand was it? And what did they want from Aldrich Beaumont badly enough to arrange the ruin of his future around it? And was it already too late to stop them? She did not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed in her room on Cutter's Lane, with the ceiling above her and the sounds of the street below filtering through the thin walls, and she thought about Aldrich Beaumont's eyes. Not in the way women thought about handsome men's eyes in the novels. Sunniva sometimes passed to her second hand. She thought about them in the practical sense, the way she thought about most things, as information, as data about the person behind them. What she had seen in those 3 seconds of his full attention was not charm, not the lazy appreciation of a man accustomed to looking at women as decorative objects. It was assessment. Real, rapid, unsparing assessment, the kind that moved past the surface to the structure beneath. He had looked at her and tried to understand what she was. She had looked at him and done the same. She rose before 5 and dressed in her ordinary clothes and made tea on the small brazier she kept near the window, and sat with it in the grey early light, and thought about what Evanthea had told her, the blood connection, her mother's silence on the subject of her own father, the particular kind of damage that silence represented, which Iseldra now understood with a clarity that was not comfortable because it meant her mother had carried a secret her entire life to protect her daughter from knowing that someone powerful had looked directly at them both and chosen not to see. She put the thought down. There would be time for it later. There was always time for the deeper grief later, when the immediate problem had been addressed. The immediate problem was the broken engagement and the invisible hand behind it. Evanthea had told her the woman's name the night before, in the corridor outside the card room, while Aldrich's voice came through the door, asking for fresh cards. Rosalind Pembridge, eldest daughter of Lord Pembridge of Wiltshire. The engagement had been announced in the spring, broken in September, and the stated reason, to a vague reference to incompatibility of disposition, was the kind of reason that covered everything and said nothing. Iseldra had asked Evanthea directly whether Aldrich had done something to justify the break, and Evanthea had said, with the precision of someone who had asked herself the same question repeatedly, no. He is not an easy man, but he has not been dishonest, and he has not been cruel, and the Pembridges knew his character before they accepted him, which meant someone had shown them something, or told them something, or threatened them with something, and had done it quietly enough that Aldrich himself, who was not a stupid man, had not yet identified the source. Iseldra went to see Sunniva that morning. Sunniva Crane was the kind of woman London produced in its practical hours, the hours before noon, before the drawing rooms and the carriage rides and the performance of leisure began. She was 30, broad-shouldered, and had the direct conversational manner of someone who had decided early that hedging wasted everyone's time. She ran her ribbon stall with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of someone who genuinely liked people, which was unusual enough to be worth noting. She listened to everything Iseldra told her without interrupting, which was one of the things Iseldra valued most about her. When Iseldra finished, Sunniva was quiet for a moment, straightening a bolt of green ribbon with hands that didn't need to be doing anything but needed something to do while she thought. "The Pembridge family," she said. "Lord Pembridge specifically. You want to know who he is afraid of." "I want to know who he owes," Iseldra said. "There is a difference. A man acting out of fear makes one kind of decision. A man acting out of debt makes another." Sunniva looked at her sideways. "You know I sell ribbon. You also talk to every household in this quarter of London, and remember everything you hear." Sunniva considered this. "Pembridge has a son," she said. "Younger son, about 19. There was talk in the summer, I heard it from one of the Pembridge housemaids who buys her trim here, that the young man had gotten himself into some kind of arrangement with a card house near Street James. Not a reputable one," she paused. "The kind where the debt doesn't stay financial." Iseldra absorbed this. "Who runs it?" "That I don't know." Sunniva set down the ribbon. "But I know someone who might. There's a woman who comes here Thursdays, buys velvet, talks more than she should. She was a lady's companion for years, before her mistress married and dismissed the staff. She knows everyone who has ever lost money at cards in this city." "When is Thursday?" Iseldra said. 3 days. She could not wait 3 days. She understood this the moment she said it, because whatever was moving around Aldrich Beaumont was already in motion, had been in motion since September, and 3 days was 3 days for it to move further in a direction she could not yet see clearly. She went back to Grosvenor Square. Not to the front door this time. She went to the servants' entrance, because the servants' entrance was where information actually lived in houses like this one, and she had spent enough years in the lower registers of other people's households to know how to navigate it without looking like she didn't belong. She asked for Evanthea Beaumont's personal maid and was told to wait in the passage, and she waited, and a woman of about 40, with a capable face and sensible shoes, appeared, and looked at her with professional assessment. "Miss Voss," the woman said. She knew the name already. Evanthea had been thorough. "I need to speak with Lady Evanthea," Iseldra said. "This morning, if possible. She is with his grace at present." A pause. "He came at 8. He has been here for 2 hours." Something shifted in Iseldra's attention. He came to her. He comes when something is wrong. It is his habit. The maid's face did not change. He does not always tell her what it is. She spends a great deal of time reading what he doesn't say. Iseldra considered this for a moment. Then she said, "I'll wait." She waited 40 minutes in the small room off the servants' passage. She could hear nothing through the walls. The house was too solidly built for that. She sat with her hands in her lap and her thoughts in careful order, and when the maid returned and said Lady Evanthea would see her, she was ready. Evanthea was alone. Whatever conversation had just ended had left a trace in the room, the kind that remained after a difficult exchange, a certain quality of recently moved air. 2 chairs were angled toward each other near the fire. Evanthea was in one of them. She gestured toward the other without preamble. "Sit," she said. "He has found something." Iseldra sat. What did he find? A letter. Evanthea's hands were folded in her lap and very still, which Iseldra had begun to understand was a signal of how serious something was. The stiller the hands, the higher the concern being managed behind the composure. It arrived last night, after the ball. No signature. It was addressed to him directly at this house, not at his own. He gave it to you. He read it, came here this morning, and placed it on that table. She nodded toward the writing table near the window. He did not explain what it said. He told me only that I should be careful about any new associations I had formed recently, and that I should not do anything impulsive. A brief silence. He was talking about you. Iseldra looked at the letter on the table. He knows about me already. He knows someone was brought to this house last night by me. He does not know who, or for what purpose, or how you are connected to this family. What he knows is that I acted without telling him, and that someone whoever sent that letter knows it too. Iseldra stood and went to the table. She looked at the letter without touching it. It was short, 8 lines at most. The handwriting was unexceptional, deliberately so, the kind that had been made to conceal rather than express. It said, as far as she could read from where she stood, that the Duke of Ashworth had more enemies than he was aware of, that those enemies now knew he was being aided by people who should not be involved, and that if he wished to protect those people, he should make himself available for a private conversation at an address in Holborn at his earliest convenience. He should come alone. She stepped back from the table. "Has he gone?" she said. "He left this house 30 minutes before you arrived." Evanthia's voice was entirely level. "He said he would not be going to Holborn. He said it the way men say things they have already decided the opposite of." Iseldra looked at her. "He has gone to Holborn?" "Yes," Evanthia said. "I believe so." She was already moving toward the door. "Which street in Holborn?" she said. "Iseldra." Evanthia's voice stopped her. "Not a warning exactly. Something more complicated. He will not thank you for following him." "I am not doing it for thanks," Iseldra said. "I am doing it because you brought me into this situation and told me he needed protecting, and someone has just walked him directly toward whatever they have been constructing around him for months." Evanthia looked at her for a moment with those steady, measuring eyes. Then she picked up the letter from the table and read the address aloud. Iseldra memorized it and left. Holborn in the mid-morning was a different world from Grosvenor Square. Not inferior exactly, but differently organized, built for commerce and work rather than for the performance of wealth. The streets were busy with the purposeful traffic of people who needed to be somewhere, and Iseldra moved through them quickly, having spent years navigating this part of the city in all its moods. The address was a narrow building on a side street, set between a printer's shop and a law clerk's office. It had the anonymous face of a building that did not want to be noticed, which in Iseldra's experience was always worth noticing. She stood across the street for a moment and observed it with the attention she had developed for things that presented themselves as ordinary and were not. Aldrich Beaumont's carriage was at the end of the street. She recognized the crest from the night before. He had at least not been entirely reckless. He was not inside yet. She could see his coachman on the box, which meant he had left instructions in case he did not emerge within a certain time. But he was about to go in. She could tell from the way the carriage door had not yet closed fully. She crossed the street at a pace that was quick without appearing urgent, and reached the carriage door as it was swinging shut. Aldrich Beaumont looked at her from inside, with an expression that started as surprise and moved very rapidly to something considerably less pleasant. "Miss Voss," he said, because of course Evanthia had told him her name even if nothing else. "Don't go in," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He was in day clothes, not the tailored evening wear of last night, and the effect was to make him look less like a duke and more like a man, which she had not expected to find more alarming. "You have been in my life for less than 12 hours, he said, "and you are already at my carriage telling me what to do." "I am at your carriage telling you what I believe," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." "An important distinction," he said dryly. "Look at the building," she said. "Not at me. Look at it." He looked. She watched his eyes move across it with the same rapid assessment she had seen in the card room the night before. and she saw the moment the same thing registered for him that had registered for her, the particular anonymity of it, too careful, too blank. "The letter told you to come alone," she said. "Your coachman is still here, which tells me you are not entirely without caution, but alone means no witness to whatever happens inside. And the letter found you at your aunt's house, not your own, which means whoever sent it knew you would be at the ball last night and knew which house you would go to afterward." She kept her voice level and quiet. "They have been watching you for longer than you think, and they know about me already, which means walking into that building today will tell them everything else they need to know about what your aunt is planning." The street noise moved around them. A cart passed. Someone shouted something distant and irrelevant. Aldrich looked at her. She looked back at him with her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and the complete absence of any desire to be impressive, which she suspected was itself the thing he found most difficult to categorize. "Get in," he said finally. She got in. He closed the door. The carriage moved. She sat across from him in the confined space of it, and neither of them said anything for a moment, while the street outside shifted from Holborn back toward the wider roads. "The letter was sent to my aunt's house," he said. "That is not a publicly known address for me." "No," she said, "which means whoever sent it has information about your private arrangements that they should not have. Or someone in my aunt's household told them." "Or that," Iseldra agreed. He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. "Why are you here? The full reason." She thought about giving him the diplomatic version. She decided against it, partly because she was not naturally diplomatic, and partly because she had the strong impression that he would identify diplomacy for what it was immediately and consider it a form of dishonesty. "Your aunt believes someone is trying to damage you," she said. "She believes the broken engagement was arranged by someone with a specific purpose, and that the same person or people are now escalating. She brought me in because she thinks I can see things from an angle she cannot." She held his gaze. "I agreed to try, provisionally, because she offered me something I need, and because the problem itself is," she paused, choosing the word honestly, "interesting." "Interesting," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The carriage turned. Outside, London continued its indifferent morning. "What did she offer you?" he said. "That is between me and her, until I decide whether this arrangement becomes a formal one." He looked at her. "You are not going to tell me?" "Not yet," she said. "When I know more about what you need protecting from, and whether I am actually the person to help with it, and whether you are someone who is capable of accepting help without dismantling it, I will tell you." She looked out the window briefly and then back at him. "Right now, I need you to tell me about Rosalind Pembridge." The name did something to his face. Nothing large, a minor adjustment in the jaw, a slight alteration in how he held his eyes. The kind of movement that came from a word landing in a place that was still tender. "What about her?" he said. "She ended the engagement. Did she tell you herself, or did her father?" "Her father wrote." "She did not. She sent no word of her own." "Have you seen her since?" He looked out the window. "Once. At a distance. She did not approach me." "Was she afraid?" Iseldra said. He brought his eyes back to her slowly. "I thought it was embarrassment," he said. "Think about it again," she said. "Now that you know the break was arranged, think about her face at that distance, and tell me what you actually saw." The silence in the carriage was the kind that had work happening inside it. She watched him go back through the memory with new information, recontextualizing it the way you reread a sentence once you understand the word you misread the first time. "Afraid," he said quietly. "Yes, I think she was afraid." "Then she is not the enemy," Iseldra said. She is another person this arrangement was done to. She folded her hands in her lap. Which means the Pembridge family is being used, not acting independently. And whatever leverage is being applied to them is serious enough that Lord Pembridge chose to damage his daughter's future rather than refuse it. Aldrich looked at her with an expression that was not yet trust, and not yet its opposite either, something between the careful attention of a man recalibrating. "Who are you?" he said, properly. "That is a longer conversation," she said, "and I will have it with you. But first I need you to do something difficult." She met his eyes. "I need you to act, for the next week, as though you know nothing, as though the letter did not unsettle you, and this morning was ordinary, and you have no idea who is working against you." She paused. "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Can you?" she said again, and it was not a challenge, but it was not gentle either. "I have been doing it since September," he said quietly. And for the first time since she had met him, something entirely unguarded moved across his face. A brief, honest weariness. The kind that comes from holding a performance for too long. It was there and then it was gone, packed back behind the composure, but she had seen it. She understood it completely. "Then keep going," she said, "a little longer." The carriage moved through the streets of London, carrying the two of them, and the weight of everything that had not yet been said, and outside the city went about its business, and inside Iseldra Voss sat across from the Duke of Ashworth, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not merely surviving a situation, but moving through it with direction. That feeling was dangerous. She knew that. Direction implied stakes, and stakes implied the possibility of loss, and she had organized her entire life around not losing things she could not afford to lose. But someone was already moving against this man with patience and precision, and a reach that extended into houses and correspondence and the private arrangements of families who should have been beyond their influence. And Iseldra had spent 22 years watching how power moved when it thought no one was paying attention. She had been paying attention to everything. The question she could not yet answer, the one that stayed with her as the carriage rolled back toward Mayfair. As Aldrich looked out the window with the controlled face of a man practicing ordinary, was not who had sent the letter or what they wanted from him specifically. The question was, why now? What had changed in the last few weeks to make them accelerate? What had they seen or heard or discovered that had moved them from the slow patience of September to the bold directness of last night's letter? What did they know that she didn't yet? And was it something about Aldrich or something about her? The carriage dropped her at the corner of Cutter's Lane because she did not give him the full address. She was not ready for him to know exactly where she lived, not out of shame, though the shame was there in the small, quiet way it always was, but because information was the only currency she had ever reliably possessed, and she was not in the habit of spending it before she understood its value in a given exchange. Aldrich had not pressed her. He had looked at the corner she indicated with an expression she could not fully interpret, and said nothing, and she had stepped out of the carriage and walked down the lane without looking back. She had listened to the carriage move away, and felt, oddly, the specific solitude of someone who has just closed a door. They are not certain they can reopen. She had 3 days until Suneva's Thursday contact. She did not wait 3 days. She went back to Suneva that afternoon and said plainly that she needed the name of whoever ran the card house near Street James, and she needed it without waiting for Thursday. Suneva had looked at her for a long moment with the particular attention she used when she was deciding how worried to be, and then she had pulled her coat from behind the stool and told the boy, watching the next pitch, to mind her ribbon and walked with Iseldra to a public house 3 streets over, where a man named Corvin Leach drank every afternoon from 2 until the money ran out. Corvin Leach was not what Iseldra had expected, which was becoming a pattern in her life. She had expected someone visibly compromised the worn look of a man who lived in the lower registers of other people's secrets. What she found was a man of perhaps 55, with a clerk's careful hands and a clerk's careful face, the kind of person who passed through the world without snagging on anything, which was, she understood immediately, exactly how he had survived doing what he did. He knew who she was within 30 seconds of her sitting down, not her name, her type. He assessed her the way Aldrich had assessed her, with that rapid structural intelligence, and what he saw made him sit back slightly, which she interpreted as a form of respect. "The house near Street James," she said, without preamble, because she had already judged that Corvin Leach was not a man who rewarded social performance. "Who owns it?" He wrapped both hands around his glass. "That depends on what you mean by owns. The person whose interests are protected when a young man from a good family finds himself in debt there that cannot be resolved with money." Something shifted in his face, very small but real. "You know about the Pembridge boy?" "I know enough," she said, which was true if slightly misleading in its confidence. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Sunniva, who said nothing, who simply looked back with the expression of a woman who has introduced 2 people and is now allowing them to find their own level. He looked back at Iseldra. "The house is a front," he said, and his voice had dropped to the register of a man being careful without appearing to be. "It changes hands on paper every 2 years or so. The actual interest behind it belongs to a man named Fulton, Gideon Fulton. He operates in a specific way. He does not want money from the families he hooks. He wants compliance. Specific, targeted compliance when he needs it, from people who have enough social position to be useful and enough exposure to be manageable." Iseldra said, "Fulton." "You won't find him in any directory," Corvin said. "He is not in society. He operates beside it, underneath it. He has been doing this for 20 years, and no one has successfully moved against him because the people who could have couldn't afford the exposure." He paused. "What do you want him for?" "I want to understand what he wants from the Duke of Ashworth," she said. The silence that followed was notable. Corvin set his glass down with a care that was not about the glass. "Go home, miss whoever you are," he said. "Not because I don't respect the question, because the last person who asked a version of that question was a solicitor's clerk who spent 6 months trying to trace Fulton's financial connections, and he is currently in debtor's prison on charges that appeared from nowhere and were processed with extraordinary speed." She looked at him. "I hear you," she said. "Tell me anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Ashworth has a land holding in the north, a specific parcel adjoining a larger estate that Fulton has been trying to acquire through various intermediaries for 3 years. The Duke won't sell, won't even discuss it. The land has been in the Beaumont family for 140 years, and he treats it accordingly." He picked up his glass. "Fulton needs him either compliant enough to sell, or discredited enough that the holding can be contested through other means." "The broken engagement," Iseldra said. "First step," Corvin said. "Isolate him. Remove the Pembridge alliance. Make him appear unstable, poorly chosen, the kind of man whose family connections are dissolving that creates legal and social vulnerability. Next step would have been the letter." "The letter came already," she said. He looked at her sharply. "When?" "Last night." He was quiet for a moment. "Then he is moving faster than he usually does. Something has changed his timeline. He looked at her with something that was not quite warning and not quite care, but was some combination of both. You said you want to understand what Fulton wants. What do you intend to do with the understanding? Stop him, she said. He laughed, not unkindly. With what? Information, she said, properly used. He studied her for another long moment. Then he reached into his coat and removed a small card, blank on one side, and wrote something on the other, and pushed it across the table to her. There is a woman named Hetty Marsh who keeps a lodging house in Clerkenwell. She is not connected to Fulton, and he believes she is not connected to anyone else of consequence, which is Fulton's one significant miscalculation. He tapped the card. Tell her Corvin sent you. She will know what that means. Iseldra took the card. She went to Clerkenwell the next morning. Hetty Marsh was 70, if she was a day, small and iron-spined, with the quick eyes of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching the door. She ran a lodging house that was cleaner than its street suggested, and more interesting than its exterior promised. She listened to Iseldra's introduction, considered the name Corvin Leach with the expression of someone receiving information they had been expecting for some time, and then said, "Come through," in a voice that left no room for uncertainty about whether Iseldra was going to follow. She followed. In the back room, over tea that was strong and seriously meant, Hetty told her things that rearranged Iseldra's understanding of the situation in ways she had not anticipated. Fulton had not been working alone for years. He had a partner, not an equal partner, but a social one. Someone inside the world he operated beneath, who moved in the drawing rooms and ballrooms that Fulton could not access, who identified targets and provided intelligence about their private arrangements and vulnerabilities. Someone whose presence in those rooms would not be questioned, someone who had been at the Ashworth ball last night. Iseldra went very still. "Who?" she said. Hetty looked at her steadily. "Do you know a woman named Cordelia Finch-Morrow?" The laughter from the ballroom entrance moved through her memory like cold water. She sat with that for a moment. Cordelia, who had been positioned at the centre of the room's social architecture, who had seen Iseldra arrive and had responded with the automatic cruelty of someone defending territory. Cordelia, who laughed behind her fan and whose cruelty had not missed its mark as entirely as Iseldra had told herself it had. She thought about the timing. Cordelia had seen her arrive, had seen Avanthia collect her, had watched the direction they moved in, and how long they were absent from the room. The letter had arrived at Avanthia's house that same night. She reported to him immediately, Iseldra said. She always does, Hetty said. She has been his eyes in that world for 5 years. She tells him who is forming alliances, who is spending more than they should, who has something to hide. She is very good at it, because nobody considers her particularly intelligent, which she cultivates deliberately. Iseldra thought about the night before, about standing in the ballroom entrance in her mended dress and holding her chin level and telling herself the laughter did not reach her. She thought about how comprehensively she had misread the room, had seen cruelty where there was strategy, had seen thoughtlessness where there was deliberate intelligence. She did not stay with the discomfort of that long. There was no point. "What does Cordelia want from the arrangement?" she said. "Finch-Morrow family is in debt," Hetty said. "Has been for years. Fulton holds it. Cordelia's cooperation is the interest payment." A pause. "She does not love what she does. That is my impression, for what it is worth. But she has been doing it long enough that I am not certain she remembers how to stop." Iseldra went home and sat in her room and thought for a very long time. She thought about Cordelia with this information, the same way she had thought about the ballroom the night before, dismantling the surface version and reconstructing it with the new facts applied. A woman who had been funny and practiced and deliberately visible, who had drawn all the room's attention to the figure in the entrance, because attention was useful. Because if everyone was looking at the girl in the mended dress, no one was watching Cordelia watch which direction Evanthia led her. She thought about herself at 22, sitting across from a man in a moving carriage, telling him she was interesting in the problem. She thought about the speed with which she had been identified and reported. She thought about the accelerated timeline Corvin had described. Something had changed Fulton's pace, and she understood now what it was. Her. She was the change. An unknown person brought privately into the Ashworth house by Evanthia, whose connection to the family was not yet public, whose capabilities were not yet known, who represented a variable Fulton had not accounted for and now needed to neutralize before she became a problem. She was already a problem. She simply had not realized how immediately. She went to Aldrich. She sent a note to Grosvenor Square that said only, "I need an hour." The response came within 40 minutes, not through a servant, but in his own handwriting. "Come now." He was in his study when she arrived. Not the formal reception room, not the drawing room, the working study, which told her something about how he had decided to receive her, which told her something about how he had been thinking about her since the carriage. The room was organized in a way that matched how she had been beginning to understand him, not tidy in the performative sense, but structured, things placed where they were with intention. She told him everything. Fulton, the land, the card house, the Pembridge boy, Corvin, Hetty, and finally Cordelia. She told him in the order she had assembled it, because the order mattered, and she wanted him to experience the understanding building the way it had built in her, so that by the time she arrived at Cordelia, his mind was in the same place hers had been when she arrived there. She watched his face through all of it. He was extraordinarily still. She had noticed this before, the quality of his stillness under pressure, which was different from composure in the practiced social sense. It was something more fundamental, a stillness that went down to the bone. He had lived in situations where reaction was a liability and had trained the instinct out of himself at some deep level, and she found that she recognized this in the particular way that you recognize something in another person that you also have in yourself. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. He stood at the window in his working study with his hands behind his back and looked at the garden below with eyes that were not seeing the garden. "Cordelia has been in this house," he said, "at dinners, at events. She has been in rooms where conversations happened that I believed were private." "Yes," Iseldra said. "She was at the dinner where I told Evanthia about the Pembridge engagement before it was announced." "It? Yes." He turned from the window. "The land in the north," he said. "I have had 3 approaches through intermediaries in the past 2 years. I declined all of them. I told no one the details of those approaches except my solicitor and Evanthia." "Evanthia's drawing room," Iseldra said. "Yes." He said it with the specific weight of a man, understanding fully how long and from how close he has been observed. He moved to his desk and sat, not with defeat, but with the recalibrating energy of a man shifting from one mode to another. What does he need to make his legal challenge to the land? "Evidence that you are not a competent steward of the estate," she said. "Social instability helps the broken engagement was the beginning of that. A formal challenge to your character or judgment through legal or social channels would accelerate it." She paused. "Or evidence of a financial irregularity in the estate management which he would manufacture if he could access the records." "My estate records are in my solicitor's office," Aldrich said. "Is your solicitor beyond approach?" The silence was brief but sufficient. He said, "I believed so." Find out, she said. Today. He looked at her across the desk with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one he produced when someone said something that matched the conclusion he had reached independently and had not yet spoken. It was not a large expression. It was a slight adjustment around the eyes, a minor settling of the jaw. But it was consistent, and she had catalogued it. You came here with a plan, he said. I came here with the beginning of one, she said. The rest depends on whether you are willing to do something that will be publicly uncomfortable. He looked at her steadily. Tell me. Fulton needs you isolated and unstable, she said. He needs the social narrative around you to suggest a man whose judgment is questionable, whose alliances are dissolving. The broken engagement was step one. She held his gaze. We need to reverse that narrative, loudly and quickly, before he can consolidate whatever his next step is. A counter-narrative, Aldrich said. A visible alliance, she said. Something the room cannot ignore, and Fulton cannot quietly dismantle. She paused, because this was the part she had not yet decided how to say. Evanthia is going to document the blood connection between my mother and your family. When that documentation is complete, I am no longer a woman in a mended dress that Cordelia Finch Morrow can laugh at. I am a Beaumont by blood, which means whatever alliance is formed between us has the full weight of that name behind it. He was very quiet. That is what she offered you, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look with the same level chin she had held everything else with since she was 15 years old in November rain. And you are willing to use it this way, he said, before you have had time to, he paused, searching for the right word, to simply have it for yourself. It was an unexpected question. She had not prepared for it because she had not expected him to ask it, and the fact that he had asked it moved something in her chest in a way she noted and set aside for later examination. I have been waiting my whole life for a solid floor under my feet, she said. I would rather build it into something than stand on it alone. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the study window, London went about its morning, and inside the room the fire burned steadily, and something shifted between them that was not yet named and did not need to be yet. But that was real, in the way that only a few things in her life had ever been completely real. Tell me the rest of the plan, he said. She told him. He did not interrupt once, and when she finished, he looked at her with something in his face that was not the rapid structural assessment from the card room, and not the careful recalibration of the carriage, but something quieter and more direct and entirely without armour. And he said, I am glad my aunt found you. It was not a grand thing to say. It was a simple thing. But Iseldra understood, from long practice in reading what people actually meant beneath what they said, that it was also an honest one. And honesty, from a man who had been surrounded by strategic performance for long enough to be deeply tired of it, was not a small thing at all. She looked at the fire. Don't be glad yet, she said. We haven't finished. But something in her, quiet and careful and long practiced in not wanting things she could not afford to want, had already begun to shift. She could feel it. That was the part that frightened her most. The documentation arrived on a Thursday. Evanthia sent it by hand, carried by her personal maid, in a plain envelope sealed with no crest, deliberately unmarkable, the kind of envelope that passed through London every hour without attracting attention. Iseldra was at Suneva's stall when it reached her, standing in the mid-morning cold with her hands wrapped around a cup of something hot that Suneva had produced from somewhere, and she read it standing because she could not bring herself to wait. It was 3 pages. The first was a formal genealogical record, witnessed and signed by two solicitors, tracing her mother's birth and parentage in the clean, unemotional language of legal documents that contained, nonetheless, the most emotional information she had ever received. The second was a letter from Evanthia to her own solicitor, directing that the necessary papers be filed to recognize Iseldra's connection to the family. The third was a personal note from Evanthia in her small, upright handwriting that said only, "This is yours, regardless of what comes next. It was always yours." Iseldra folded the pages back into the envelope. Sunniva was watching her with the careful attention she used when she was deciding whether to speak or stay quiet. She stayed quiet, which was the right choice, and Iseldra stood in the cold for a moment and let the weight of it move through her without trying to manage it. Her mother's name in a legal document. Her mother's father's name beside it. The Beaumont line drawn in ink, connecting her backward through a history that had always been hers and had always been deliberately kept from her. And she had spent 22 years in the cold consequence of that deliberate absence without knowing the full shape of what had been withheld. She put the envelope in her coat. She had things to do. The feeling could wait. It would be there when the rest was finished, and she would sit with it properly then, in a quiet room, alone, and let it be as large as it actually was. For now, there was Gideon Fulton. The plan she had laid out in Aldrich's study 3 days ago had 3 parts, and the first 2 were already in motion. The first was the documentation, which was now done. The second had required Aldrich to do the socially uncomfortable thing she had described, which was to appear publicly at 2 morning calls and 1 afternoon gathering, with a composure so complete and a demeanour so entirely unbothered that the narrative of an isolated, destabilized duke began to look, to anyone watching, like a miscalculation. He had done it with the practiced ease of a man who had extensive experience being looked at, and she had heard from Evanthia, who heard from everyone, that the rooms had noticed. Cordelia Finch Morrow had been at one of those gatherings. That was the part Iseldra had not planned, and had not been able to predict whether Cordelia would be present for the counter-narrative, whether she would see it clearly enough to understand what was happening, whether she would report it to Fulton in a way that would accelerate his response or make him cautious. She had apparently reported it immediately, because on the morning of the 3rd day, 2 things happened. The first was that Aldrich's solicitor sent a message saying that someone had made an inquiry about the northern land holding through an intermediary, framed as a routine property inquiry, but containing specific questions about estate, debt, and management records that could only have been meaningful to someone with a particular purpose. The solicitor had responded with nothing and sent the message to Aldrich within the hour. It was not the solicitor Iseldra had feared. She noted this. The second thing was that Iseldra was followed. She noticed it on the walk back from Suniva's stall. In the specific way, she noticed things that were slightly wrong, not through any dramatic signal, but through the accumulated texture of small inconsistencies. The same man had been at the corner of 3 different streets. He was not looking at her. That was the tell. People who were not following you did not work so hard at not looking at you. She did not change her pace. She walked back to Cutter's Lane at the same rhythm she always used, and went inside, and climbed the stairs, and stood at her window out of direct sight, and watched the street below until she identified where he had positioned himself. He was good. He had chosen a spot that gave him sight lines to both the lane entrance and the side alley, without being obviously static. She estimated he had done this before. She sent a note to Aldrich that said, "It has begun. Be ready for tonight. Do not come to me." His response came back in 40 minutes. Understood. Evanthia has been moved. The note was already planned for. The third part of the plan was tonight. She spent the afternoon in her room, which was partly practical and partly because she needed the hours. The documentation sat in her coat pocket, and she took it out once, sat with it at the table by the window, and let herself have 30 minutes of being simply a person to whom something important had been given, before she packed it away again and went back to being someone with a specific problem to solve. Sunniva arrived at 4, as planned, with a dress. Not a mended one. A real one, dark green silk, borrowed from the wardrobe of Sunniva's former employer's daughter, who was away in Bath, and who was, Sunniva said with the unapologetic practicality of a woman who arranged things, approximately Iseldra's size and unlikely to notice before Monday. It fit. Not perfectly, but well enough that the imperfection was invisible to anyone not looking closely for it, and the people at the Ashworth ball tonight would not be looking closely at the dress. They would be looking at who she arrived with. Sunniva helped her dress and did not make it sentimental, which Iseldra was grateful for, because sentiment would have made it harder to stay clear. She looked in the narrow mirror when it was done and saw something she had not seen there before, not beauty exactly, though the dress was beautiful, but presence. The posture she had maintained through years of difficult rooms had always been there. The dress simply made it visible to people who required a certain kind of signal before they allowed themselves to see. The carriage arrived at 7, not a hired one this time. The Ashworth crest was on the door. She went down. Aldrich was inside. He looked at her when she got in, with the expression she had learned to read, that minor adjustment that meant he was recalibrating something, and she sat across from him and said nothing, and neither did he for a moment. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the one that had developed over the past week in his study during the planning hours, when they were both thinking and did not need to fill the air. "Cordelia will be there," he said. "I am counting on it," she said. "And if Fulton moves before we are ready?" "He won't," she said. "He needs the right setting. He needs us in a room full of witnesses where what he reveals has maximum damage. He's been patient for months. He will wait for the moment that costs us most." She looked at the window, at the London evening moving past it. That is also his weakness. Patient men trust their patience too much. They stop expecting improvisation. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "You have thought about this a great deal." "I have thought about very little else for 4 days." "Does it frighten you?" She looked at him. It was a direct question, the kind he had been asking with increasing frequency over the past week, not tactical questions, but the other kind, the ones that were about her specifically, about what was happening inside the structure of her thinking. She had been answering them honestly, because dishonesty with him felt like a waste of the energy she needed for everything else. "Yes," she said. "What frightens me is not Fulton. What frightens me is that I have started to care about the outcome in a way that goes beyond what Evanthia offered me." She held his gaze. "That is dangerous for my thinking." He looked at her for a long moment. "It doesn't show," he said, "in your thinking." "It will if we fail," she said. "Then we won't fail," he said, and it was so straightforward, so entirely without performance, that she felt it land somewhere in her chest with a weight that she had not prepared for. She looked back at the window. The carriage was turning onto the wider street now, the houses becoming grander, the lamplights closer together. The Ashworth ball, not at Aldrich's own house this time, but at the Marchmonts', whose events were the centrepiece of the late season, and whose guest list included everyone who mattered, and several people who mattered in ways that were not immediately visible. Evanthia had arranged the invitation 3 days ago. Evanthia, who was not attending tonight, who was safely at her own house, under the care of her maid and a locked door, because part of what they were protecting was the one person who had set all of this in motion, and who Fulton did not yet fully understand the significance of. They entered together. The room adjusted the way rooms did. The particular quality of attention that moved through a gathering when something unexpected appeared at the entrance, not loudly, but as a current underneath the music and the conversation, a collective recalibration. Iseldra, in the green dress beside the Duke of Ashworth, arrived together, announced together by the footman at the door, as she had never been announced anywhere in her life. She heard her name in the footman's clear voice, and felt something happen to her spine, not weakness, but its opposite, a kind of alignment, as though something that had been slightly wrong for 22 years had been corrected. She kept her chin level. She always kept her chin level. She found Cordelia within 40 seconds. It was not difficult. Cordelia had positioned herself, as she always did, at the centre of the room's best sightline, the position that appeared social and was actually strategic. She was watching the entrance. She had seen them, and the thing that moved across her face when she processed what she was seeing was not the practiced amusement of a woman who had laughed behind her fan at the Ashworth ball a week ago. It was something considerably less composed. She reached for her fan. Iseldra watched her reach for it, and understood, in that moment, exactly what would happen next. Cordelia would send word to Fulton during the next 30 minutes, using whatever her usual method was. Fulton, who was already watching the situation accelerate beyond his modelled timeline, would now know that the woman he had moved to neutralize was standing in the most visible room in London, on the arm of the man he had been working to isolate, announced under a name that connected her to the Beaumont family. He would act tonight. He had no choice. His entire architecture depended on Aldrich being vulnerable, and Aldrich was demonstrably not vulnerable, and the window for quiet management had just closed in a room full of witnesses. She had planned for this. The next hour was the most precisely managed of her life. She moved through the room with Aldrich, speaking to people, receiving the particular attention that came with the combination of novelty and implication. Who was she? How was she connected? What did her presence beside the Duke mean? She answered every question with the exact quantity of information required, and no more. And she smiled when smiling was the right thing, and was serious when that was right. And she felt herself doing it with a fluency she had not known she possessed, as though the years of watching from the outside had been, all along, a kind of preparation. Aldrich was beside her through most of it, and the specific experience of being beside him in a room, being in the same conversation, watching how he managed people with the particular directness that was also a form of respect, was teaching her things about him at a rate that would have felt overwhelming if she had been paying that kind of attention to herself, which she was not. She was paying attention to the room. She saw the man arrive at 9:40. He came through the side entrance, not the main door, but the door used by late arrivals who knew the house well, which told her he had been here before, which told her he had been cultivating the Marchmont connection as well as the others. He was perhaps 55, unremarkably dressed in the good quality, undistinguished way of a man who wanted to be admitted to rooms and forgotten in them. He had a face built for being forgotten, not unpleasant, not memorable, the face of an intelligent man who had decided long ago that invisibility was worth more than presence. She knew immediately that this was Fulton. She said quietly, without moving her gaze, "He is here." Aldrich, who was in the middle of a conversation about something agricultural, did not look. "Where?" he said, at the same unchanged volume. "Side entrance. Dark coat. He's moving toward the card room." "How certain are you?" "Completely," she said. A pause. "Then we move now." They excused themselves from the agricultural conversation with the unhurried ease of two people whose next obligation happened to be elsewhere, which was a performance that Iseldra found she was capable of producing under pressure, which was itself a discovery. They crossed the room at a pace that did not announce urgency and entered the corridor that connected to the card room through the library. The library was not empty. Cordelia Finch Morrow was there, standing by the writing desk in the far corner, and the small piece of paper in her hand was already written on. She looked up when they entered, with the expression of someone caught, not in a general sense, but in the specific, irreversible sense that lands differently. Iseldra looked at her. Cordelia looked back. Something moved across her face that was not the practiced social performance, it was underneath that. The real face of a woman who had been doing something corrosive for 5 years and who was looking at the end of it without knowing what came after. "You don't have to send it," Iseldra said. The room was very quiet. Cordelia's hand was still. "You don't know what he'll do," she said. Her voice had changed thinner, less constructed. "I know what he's already done," Iseldra said. "I know about the debt. I know about your family. I know he has used you the way he uses everyone by making the alternative look impossible." She kept her voice even and without judgment, because judgment was not useful here, and she could feel how close the balance was. "The debt can be addressed. There are legal means. Aldrich's solicitor can—" "You think it's about the debt?" Cordelia said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a laugh and not quite grief. "The debt was paid 3 years ago. I stayed because he knows things. About my brother. About what my brother did before he died." Her jaw was tight. "Things that would destroy what is left of my family's name." Iseldra absorbed this. She looked at Aldrich briefly. He was looking at Cordelia with an expression that had moved past tactical and into something more human. The face of a man encountering the actual cost of what had been done to the people around him, not just to himself. "Give me the note," Iseldra said, "and tell me what he knows about your brother, all of it, tonight." She held Cordelia's gaze. "Because if we are going to move against him, we need to understand everything he holds, and you are the only person in this room who knows the full inventory." Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she set the note on the desk. It was the most significant capitulation Iseldra had ever witnessed. And it was also the quietest one, a single piece of paper set down by a woman who had been performing cruelty for 5 years, to cover the fact that she was more frightened than anyone in the room had ever thought to consider. "There isn't time," Aldrich said. "He'll be expecting the note." "Then we give him one," Iseldra said. She looked at Cordelia. "Not this one, a different one. One that brings him to a specific place at a specific time." Cordelia understood. She sat at the writing desk. Iseldra stood at her shoulder, and they wrote it together. Cordelia's hand, Iseldra's construction, and when it was done, it was convincing in the particular way that things written by the person the recipient trusts are convincing, because the texture of familiarity is impossible to replicate from the outside. The note asked Fulton to come to the small sitting room off the east corridor at 10 o'clock. It said that the situation had changed, and there was something he needed to see. A footman carried it into the card room. Iseldra watched from the library doorway and saw the moment it arrived, saw Fulton read it with the focused economy of a man accustomed to receiving intelligence, saw him stand and move toward the east corridor with the confidence of a man who had never, in 20 years, arrived at a meeting he had not controlled. She let him get 3 minutes ahead. Then she moved. Aldrich was beside her. They walked through the corridor with 2 other people behind them, the Marchmont's own house solicitor, whom Aldrich had spoken to earlier in the week, and a second man whose name Iseldra had not needed to know, only to understand that he had the correct authority to make what happened next official. Fulton was in the sitting room when they entered. He turned, with the smooth unhurriedness of a man expecting Cordelia, and received instead the four of them. And the specific quality of his stillness in that moment was the stillness of a very intelligent person processing a catastrophic miscalculation. Iseldra placed the documents on the table before he could speak. Not all of them the right ones, in the right order, the ones that traced the card house, the Pembridge debt, the approach to Aldrich's solicitor, and the letter to the Beaumont house the night of the ball. She had spent 4 days identifying exactly which documents would close the available exits, and she had found them all, with help from Corvin and Hetty, and the particular investigative intelligence of a woman who had nothing to lose and therefore nothing to be cautious about. Fulton looked at them. He did not touch them. He looked at Iseldra, not at Aldrich, at her, with the expression of a man who is recataloguing a threat he had profoundly underestimated. "Miss Voss," he said. "Beaumont," she said. The first time she had said it out loud, it fitted cleanly in her mouth, without effort, as though it had always been waiting there. The room was very quiet. Fulton looked at the documents. He looked at the solicitor. He looked at the second man. He calculated she could see it happening, the rapid assessment of options and exits, and what each of them cost, and he arrived. With the disciplined accuracy of a man who had survived 20 years by knowing when a room had closed around him at the only conclusion available. "What do you want?" he said. "The land is not for sale," Aldrich said. "It was not for sale in any of the 3 approaches through your intermediaries. It will not be for sale through this approach or any subsequent one." He looked at Fulton with the directness that was his particular form of authority, not performed, not loud, but absolute in the way that things are absolute when they are simply true. "The Pembridge family will be released from whatever you hold over them. The documentation for that release will be delivered to my solicitor within the week. Cordelia Finch Morrow's brother's affairs will be buried and will remain so." He paused. "In exchange, this ends tonight, permanently." Fulton looked at him. "And if I decline?" Aldrich looked at the documents on the table. He said nothing. Fulton understood. He had understood from the moment they walked in. The performance of considering his options was simply the last dignified thing available to him in the room. He straightened his coat. "The release will be with your solicitor by Thursday," he said. He left. The room held the shape of him for a moment after the door closed, the way rooms hold the shape of things that have just ended. Iseldra stood at the table with her hands flat on the documents and let herself breathe, really breathe, the first time since the note had been carried into the card room, the first time since the carriage on the way here, possibly the first time since Cutter's Lane. She heard Aldrich take a breath beside her that was the same kind. The solicitor said something about paperwork, and the second man said something in response, and they moved toward the door, together with the practical efficiency of men whose part in the evening was complete. And then they were gone, and the room was just the 2 of them. Aldrich looked at her. She looked at the documents. "Beaumont," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not the dry control she had spent 2 weeks learning to read through. Something quieter. It sounded right. She looked at the table. "It felt right," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, which meant the steadiness was genuine, which meant it had been there all along, underneath everything she had layered over it. She picked up the documents. She squared them with the careful hands of someone who understands the weight of paper when it contains the right things. Outside the sitting-room door, the ball continued. Music and voices and the 100 small negotiations of a London gathering going on exactly as it would have gone on regardless. The world did not pause for what had just happened in a small room off the east corridor. It never did. But inside, something was different. She was different. Not in a way she could yet fully describe, and not in a way that required description tonight. She had walked into this evening as someone on the edge of something enormous, and she was standing on the other side of it now, and the ground was not what she had imagined it would feel like. It was more ordinary, more solid, the way real things felt, as opposed to the way you imagined them when you were still trying to earn them. Aldrich was watching her with the expression she had not yet catalogued, because she had not seen it before tonight. Not assessment, not recalibration, not the careful management of a man used to performance. Something open. Something that had decided it was done being careful. She looked at him. "What happens now?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe that depends entirely on what you want." It was the first time anyone had asked her that. Not what she needed, not what she could offer, not what the arrangement required, what she wanted. Sitting in the middle of the room after the most significant evening of her 22 years, given back to her as though it were the simplest question in the world. She held the documents in her hands and felt the weight of them, and thought about her mother standing at windows and saying nothing, and about a girl of 15 in November rain, and about 11 years of mended seams and borrowed flatirons, and the specific discipline of wanting nothing you could not afford to lose. She looked at the man in front of her who had asked her the question as though her answer was the most important thing in the room. "I want to go home," she said. And then, because honesty had served her better than anything else had in the past 2 weeks, she said, "I don't entirely know where that is yet." He was quiet for a moment. "We could work that out," he said. "If you were willing." She looked at him. He held the look with everything open that had been closed when she first saw him across a card table 10 days ago. She said, "I am almost certainly willing." Outside, London continued. Inside, Iseldra Beaumont, the names settling around her quietly, without fanfare, without anything except the simple rightness of a thing that was always true, finally being said aloud, stood in a sitting room off the east corridor, and understood that the ending she had walked into tonight was not an ending at all. It was the first night of something she did not yet have a name for. That was all right. She had time now. For the first time in her life, she had time. The release papers arrived on a Wednesday, not a Thursday as Fulton had promised, which Iseldra noted without surprise. Men like Fulton, she had come to understand, performed small gestures of compliance early, when the alternative was large consequences later. It was a way of maintaining the illusion of agency in a situation where agency had been entirely removed. She accepted the gesture for what it was, and did not mistake it for sincerity. Aldrich's solicitor confirmed the documents were complete and binding at 10 in the morning. By noon, a separate letter had been dispatched to Lord Pembridge in Wiltshire. Iseldra did not read it. She had asked only that it be honest about what had been done to his family, and clear about what it meant going forward. And Aldrich had written it himself, rather than dictating to a clerk, which was the choice she would have made, and which told her something about the direction his thinking had been moving in. She spent that morning at Cutter's Lane. She had not given up the room. She was not ready to, and she had been honest with Aldrich about that when the question had arisen the morning after the Marchmont ball. In his study over the first cup of tea, either of them had managed, in what felt like several years. She had told him she needed time inside the new shape of things before she moved physically into them, and he had said he understood, and she had believed him because he had a way of understanding things without requiring them to be explained twice, that she had been quietly relying on for 2 weeks without fully acknowledging it. The room on Cutter's Lane looked different now. Not because anything in it had changed the narrow bed, the borrowed brazier, the mirror with the slight warp in the glass that made her left shoulder look higher than her right. Everything was exactly as it had been, but she was standing in it with different information about herself, and different information changed the room because it changed the person reading it. She sat at the small table by the window and took out the documentation Evanthia had sent and read it again, slowly, in the morning light. She had read it several times now, and each time she found something she had moved past too quickly, the time before a detail in the genealogical record, a phrase in Evanthia's letter. This time, what she found was a date, her mother's birth year, recorded with a specificity that meant someone had known exactly when and where, and had chosen, for 38 years, not to record it formally. Her grandfather had known, had always known, had looked at a woman carrying his child, and had calculated that acknowledgement cost more than silence, and had chosen silence. She sat with that for a long time, not with rage, she was past rage, or perhaps had never quite arrived at it, having spent too many years converting difficult feeling into useful energy. She sat with it as a fact, a painful, permanent, ordinary human fact about the things people choose when their comfort is in competition with someone else's existence. It was not unusual. It was not even particularly remarkable in the history of powerful men and the women who existed inconveniently near them. It was simply what had happened, and what had happened had produced her mother, and her mother had produced her. And she was sitting here in a room on Cutter's Lane with a legal document that said the silence was over. She thought about her mother. She thought about her in a new way, now not the way a daughter thinks about a mother, which is through the lens of need and proximity, and all the things that are too close to see clearly. She thought about her as a person, a woman who had known her father's name and her father's face, and had never once, in all of Iseldra's childhood, said it with bitterness, who had given her daughter a decent mind and a straight spine, and the 11 minutes beside a dying rose bush that had apparently been significant enough to lodge in a duke's memory for 7 years, and had done all of it in a mended dress in a rented room without complaint. She was her mother's daughter. She understood now that this had always been the inheritance that mattered. She folded the documents, put them back in the envelope, and stood. There was one more thing to do today that was not about documents or solicitors or the quiet dismantling of Gideon Fulton's architecture. She had been thinking about it since the sitting room off the east corridor, and she had decided the night before that it could not wait until the formal shape of everything else was settled. She went to find Cordelia. Cordelia Finch Morrow lived with her mother in a house in Brook Street that was maintained with the specific, exhausted elegance of a family spending the last of what it had on appearances. Iseldra noticed this with the eye of someone who had spent years cataloguing that particular kind of spending. The way it showed in the slightly too thin curtains and the door knocker polished so many times it had lost definition at the edges. She knocked. The maid who answered looked at her with the cautious expression of someone accustomed to unexpected callers and unsure which category this one fell into. Iseldra gave her name and said she was there to see Miss Finch Morrow and was not expected. The maid went upstairs and came back and showed her to a small sitting room on the first floor. Cordelia was standing when she entered, not positioned actually standing, as though she had risen from her chair and couldn't decide whether to sit back down. She was in a day dress, her hair simply arranged, and without the ballroom context, without the fan and the positioning and the practiced social performance, she looked younger than Iseldra had registered. She also looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been tired for a long time and has only recently stopped pretending otherwise. "Miss Voss," she said, and caught herself. "Beaumont, I'm sorry." Iseldra said, Please sit down. They sat. The room was quiet. Outside, Brook Street moved through its mid-morning business. Iseldra had thought about what to say on the walk over, and had decided in the end to say it plainly, because plain was what had served her best in every difficult room she had been in recently. And there was no reason to use a different instrument when this one was working. I wanted you to know that the documents Fulton held about your brother have been addressed, she said. Not destroyed, because I can't verify that they have been if they're destroyed, but they are now held by Aldrich's solicitor under seal, inaccessible to anyone including Fulton, and there is a legal instrument in place that makes using them for any purpose an actionable offence. She held Cordelia's gaze. He cannot reach you through your brother anymore. Cordelia sat very still. The family debt, Iseldra continued, is genuinely cleared. Corvin Leach confirmed it was settled 3 years ago, as Fulton told you. That part was true. He kept you because you were useful, not because he needed anything from you financially. She paused. He lied to you about what he held over you. Or, not precisely lied, he allowed you to believe the threat was larger than it was. That is how he maintained the arrangement. Something moved through Cordelia's face. That was the movement of a woman understanding the specific dimensions of the cage she had been in. Not smaller than she had believed, in some ways larger, because knowing she had stayed past the point of necessity was its own kind of pain, but differently shaped, a shape that had a door. Why are you telling me this? Cordelia said. Her voice was controlled, but fragile in the specific way of things that are controlling a great deal. Because you sat down at that desk and wrote a different letter, Iseldra said, and I think it cost you something, and I think you should know that it mattered. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Cordelia said, very quietly, I laughed at you at the Ashworth ball, at your dress. I know, Iseldra said. I was reporting to him. I was calculating who you were and whether you were a threat, and I laughed because it made the room look at you, not at me. She looked at her hands. I have done things like that for 5 years, to a great many people. Yes, Iseldra said. You could have left me in it, Cordelia said. When it was done, when you had what you needed, you didn't have to come here. No, Iseldra agreed. I didn't have to. She let that sit. Cordelia looked at her with an expression that was trying to be composed and not entirely managing it, and Iseldra thought about what it cost to be seen clearly by someone you had tried to diminish, and to be offered something generous from that position. She thought it probably cost more than most things. She stayed another 30 minutes. They did not become friends in that sitting room on Brook Street that would have been too neat, too convenient, too unlike the way things actually resolved between people whose history was complicated. But something was set down that had been heavy, and the setting down of it was real, and Iseldra walked back out into the London morning, feeling lighter by exactly that weight. Suniva was at her stall when Iseldra passed it on the way home. She stopped. It's done, she said. Suniva looked at her, across a bolt of blue velvet, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this sentence for over a week. All of it. All of it. Iseldra paused. I may be moving. Not immediately. Soon. Suniva was quiet for a moment. To Grosvenor Square. That is a conversation still being had. Is it? Suniva said, in a tone that indicated she found this description mildly implausible. Iseldra almost smiled. I have conditions. Of course you do, Suniva said, with great affection and no surprise whatsoever. She went to Evanthia that afternoon. Evanthia was in her morning room, which was where Evanthia conducted all serious business, on the grounds that the morning room had the best light, and good decisions required good light. She looked at Iseldra when she came in with the particular attention of someone who has orchestrated a very complex arrangement and is now assessing the results. "Sit," she said. "Tell me." Iseldra sat and told her. All of it, in the same ordered way she had told Aldrich things beginning to end, clearly, without the embellishments that made telling easier, but made understanding harder. Evanthea listened without interruption, which was, Iseldra had come to understand, the way Evanthea expressed respect. When she finished, Evanthea sat quietly for a moment. "Your mother," she said finally, "would have been very difficult to surprise." She said it not as a deflection, but as something she had arrived at specifically, a recognition. "She got that from my father's side, apparently." "I believe so," Iseldra said. Evanthea looked at her with those steady eyes. "I did not know about you for most of your life," she said. "I want to be clear about that. When I found out, I acted. I could have acted sooner if I had known sooner." A pause. "That is not an excuse. It is only the account." "I know," Iseldra said. "I don't need the account. I have the documentation." She held the older woman's gaze. "And I have the next part, which is what matters to me." Something in Evanthea's face opened very slightly. "The next part," she said. "I want to know everything," Iseldra said. "About the family, the history, the estate, the people. Not because I need it for any immediate purpose, but because it is mine, and I was kept from it, and I am not interested in continuing to be kept from things that belong to me." Evanthea looked at her for a moment with those measuring eyes, and then she said, "Every Thursday, come here at 10. We will start from the beginning." Iseldra nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Evanthea said briskly, which was how she expressed emotion. "Come on time." The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the external sense. Fulton did not reappear. He had made his calculation in the sitting room off the east corridor, and had not, apparently, found a reason to revise it. Corvin Leach confirmed through his channels that Fulton had moved a significant portion of his London operations to premises outside the city, which was not disappearance, but was the kind of strategic withdrawal that meant he had identified London as no longer profitable. Lord Pembridge wrote to Aldrich. Aldrich showed Iseldra the letter, not because she had asked, but because he had decided she was the person in his life to whom he showed things. The letter was not an apology exactly. Pembridge did not seem to be a man with a natural facility for apology, but it was honest about what had been done to his daughter and what he had failed to prevent. And at the end of it he said that Rosalind had asked to be remembered to the Duke and wished him well. Aldrich read that line twice. Iseldra watched him read it and understood that it was the closing of something that had been left open and sore, and she was glad for him in the particular way that was not about her at all. She moved out of Cutter's Lane at the end of the month. She did not move to Grosvenor Square, because the conditions she had mentioned to Sunniver were real and had been discussed across 2 evenings in Aldrich's study, with the kind of directness that she had decided was the only way she was willing to do things going forward. She moved to a set of rooms in a house near Portman Square that Evanthea had arranged, and that were her own, properly and formally, which was the condition that had mattered most, that whatever came next, she arrived at it from a position of standing, not a position of need. Aldrich had agreed to this without argument, which she had not expected, and which had told her more about him than most of their conversations. She went to Portman Square on a Tuesday morning with 2 bags, which was everything she owned that was worth taking, and she stood in the rooms and looked at the ceiling, which was considerably higher than the ceiling at Cutter's Lane, and she thought about Well Enough, and what it had meant to her for the past 10 years, and what it meant now, which was that it was no longer the standard she was operating by. She had her own things now, not many, not yet, but they were hers, properly and legally and with documentation to support it, and she was living in them from a standing start, rather than from the long accommodation to diminishment that she had been practicing since she was 15. She stood in the center of the room and felt the floor under her feet, and it was solid. Not metaphorically, actually physically solid, in a way that she registered through the soles of her shoes as she stood there. And she thought that perhaps this was what she had been trying to describe to Aldrich in the sitting room at the Marchmonts, when she had said she didn't know where home was, yet not a place, but this. This specific quality of floor. She had it now. Sunniva came to see the rooms the following Saturday, and declared them extremely adequate and accepted tea, and said, in the way she said important things, which was sideways and without drama, "He looks at you like you are the answer to a question he has been asking for a long time." Iseldra poured tea. "He looks at everything with attention," she said. "It is his primary characteristic." "His attention is not equally distributed," Sunniva said. Iseldra handed her the cup and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, and Sunniva accepted both the cup and the answer with equal composure. The Thursdays with Evanthia were the part of her new life that surprised her most. She had expected them to be instructional in the formal sense, historical, genealogical, the recitation of family facts by a woman who organized information the way she organized everything else. And they were that, but they were also something she had not anticipated, which was the experience of being known backward through time, of having her own characteristics reflected in people she had never met and could never meet, and understanding through that reflection that she had not invented herself from nothing as she had always believed. She had assembled herself from material that had been there all along, waiting to be identified. She found her stubbornness in a great-great-grandmother who had run the estate alone for 6 years while her husband was at war. She found her particular form of stillness under pressure in Evanthia herself, who admitted it grudgingly when pressed. She found, in a portrait in the upstairs corridor of Evanthia's house, a woman with ink on her left hand, who had apparently been a committed correspondent, and was considered by her contemporaries to have been somewhat formidable. She looked at that portrait for a long time. It was not her mother. It was no one she had ever known. But something in the set of the jaw and the level quality of the eyes across 200 years of oil paint said something to her that was not words exactly, but was unmistakable. "You come from us. We were here before you. We will be here when you explain yourself to whoever comes after." She left Evanthia's house that Thursday and walked back toward Portman Square in the early evening, with London around her and the late-season light on the buildings, and the particular feeling of a city that does not know or care about the people moving through it, but that is, nonetheless, full of them, full of people carrying things, managing things, surviving things, building things from whatever material they have available. She thought about where she had been a month ago, the hired cab to the Ashworth ball, the mended dress and the borrowed flat iron, and the laughter designed to diminish her that had not entirely missed, but had not, in the end, managed its full intention. She thought about Aldrich in the carriage, asking if she was frightened. She thought about a footman reading her name in a clear voice to a room that did not yet know what to do with it. She thought about all of it the way you think about things that have settled into the past tense, not as things happening now, but as things that made now possible, the material that the present was built from. She turned onto Portman Square and stopped. Aldrich was standing outside her building, not in his carriage, not with the Ashworth footman, not in any of the formal apparatus of his position. Just standing there in the evening light in his coat with his hands in his pockets, which was, she had come to understand, the way he existed, when he was not performing anything for anyone, simply standing in a place, occupying it, waiting without making the waiting into something more than it was. He saw her and said nothing. She walked up to him and also said nothing. "I was in the neighbourhood," he said, which was not true, but was an attempt at lightness that she appreciated for the effort. "You were not," she said. "No," he agreed. They stood on the pavement in the early evening with London around them and the light changing, and something between them that was not new anymore and not yet fully named, which was fine. She had decided she was not in a hurry to name it. She had spent 22 years hurrying through the present toward a future that felt safer, and she had recently understood that the hurrying was the thing that had cost her the most. She was not going to hurry this. "Come up," she said. "There is tea." He came up. She made tea. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the room with the assessment that was always his first response to a new space. And then he looked at her, moving around in it, and the assessment changed into the expression that Sunniva had described, which Iseldra had been not quite allowing herself to look at directly, and which she looked at now because she had decided that not looking directly at things she was afraid of was the old way, and she was done with the old way. He looked at her like she had said, like the answer to something. She felt it settle in her chest as a fact, not a frightening one, just a fact, the way the solid floor was a fact, the way the documents were a fact, the way her name said aloud in a clear voice in a bright room was a fact. Real things felt like this. She was learning to recognize them. She brought the tea to the table and sat, and they talked about ordinary things for a while, the particular easy ordinary that had developed between them without announcement. And outside the window, London went into its evening, and the light faded, and neither of them mentioned what was unresolved between them, because it was not urgent, because it was moving toward its own resolution at a pace that felt right to both of them. And patience, as it turned out, was something they were both very good at. There was still the question of what came next. There was the estate and the family name and the formal shape of what her position in the world would look like, which had many possible configurations and had not yet been settled into any specific one. There was Cordelia and whatever she would build from the door that had opened for her. There was Rosalind Pembridge in Wiltshire, reading a letter and deciding what to do with it. There was Avanthia, who would be 90 if she lived to see all of it, and would probably manage it anyway, on the strength of her refusal to find anything truly surprising. There was everything that came after the ending of the thing she had walked into a month ago in a mended dress at a ballroom door. She looked at the man across the table from her, who was looking back with that open expression he had stopped protecting, and she thought about the question he had asked her at the Marchmonts. "What do you want?" She was learning the answer. It was larger than she had known to want when she was operating from the old position, from the well-enough position, from the position of a woman who had trained herself not to want things she could not afford to lose. She could afford more now. The knowledge of that was quiet and real and entirely her own, which was how she had always needed the important things to be hers first, before anything else, solid under her feet before she built on them. She drank her tea. Outside, London continued. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, she was exactly where she meant to be. And there is a question I want to leave with you before the next chapter opens, because I have been thinking about it since I started telling you this story. Iseldra spent 22 years being looked at by rooms full of people and seen as the category they put her in, the poor relation, the mended dress, the woman whose name meant nothing to anyone in those rooms. She never stopped walking into the rooms anyway. She never stopped holding her chin level. I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever walked into a room where you knew you weren't expected and walked in anyway? Have you ever been laughed at for what you didn't have and found, later, that the laugh was the smallest thing in the story? Tell me in the comments, because I think more of you know Iseldra's particular walk through that ballroom door than have ever been able to say so. If this story found something in you, stay. Subscribe so you're here for the next chapter, because what is coming for Iseldra Beaumont in her new world is not smaller than what came before. It is only different, and different, as she is beginning to understand, is not something to be afraid of. It is something to walk toward, chin level, eyes open, exactly as she always has. The first snow of the season came on a Friday morning, light and unhurried, the kind that settled on London without demanding anything from it. Iseldra stood at the window of her rooms in Portman Square and watched it come down, and thought that 3 months ago she had been standing at a different window, in a different room, looking at a different version of the world. And the distance between those two windows was not measurable in streets or weeks, but in the specific internal distance that a person crosses when they stop surviving and start living. She had been thinking about that distance a great deal lately. The formal documentation of her position in the Beaumont family had been filed in the second week of November, processed with the quiet efficiency of legal proceedings that have the right people behind them. It produced no public spectacle. Evanthea had been deliberate about that, understanding that a quiet truth was harder to contest than a loud one. There was no announcement in the papers, no formal introduction through society channels. The information simply became available to the people who needed to know it, and spread from there in the way that information spreads in London, which is thoroughly and faster than anyone intends. By the end of November, rooms knew who she was. Not all rooms, not instantly, but the ones that mattered began to adjust, and the adjustment was visible in small ways that she noted, without making too much of them, the way invitations arrived now that had not arrived before, the way she was addressed at the events she attended with Evanthea, the way conversations included her, rather than moving around her as though she were furniture that had been placed in an inconvenient location. She found it interesting more than gratifying. The gratification was there. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. But it was not the central thing. The central thing was more internal. The experience of moving through spaces without the constant low expenditure of energy that poverty required. The energy of calculation and management, and the maintenance of dignity under conditions designed to erode it. She had not known how much of herself that had cost, until the cost was removed. She had more of herself now. She was still discovering what to do with all of it. Aldrich had been a fixed point through the transition in a way she had not anticipated and had not asked for, which meant it was genuine rather than performed. He did not manage her. He did not guide her through the new landscape of her position with the subtle condescension of someone who believed she needed guidance. He simply continued to show up in her sitting room with his coat and his directness and his particular form of attention, and talked to her about the things he was thinking about, and listened when she talked about the things she was thinking about, and occasionally disagreed with her in the flat, honest way that she had come to rely on, because it meant she was never having to wonder what the true version of his opinion was. He had disagreed with her 3 days ago about Cordelia. Iseldra had been spending time with Cordelia, which had surprised her as much as it had surprised anyone else, including Cordelia. It had not been a decision exactly more than natural consequence of having sat with a woman at a desk and written something difficult together, which creates a kind of connection that has its own gravity, regardless of whether the people involved expected it. She had gone twice to Brook Street for tea, and on the second occasion Cordelia had said something that made Iseldra laugh, genuinely and without social management, which had made Cordelia look startled and then quietly pleased, and after that the thing between them had been easier. Aldrich had said he was uncertain whether the association was wise, and Iseldra had told him that wise was not the only useful standard for a decision, and that Cordelia was in a fragile position and required steady contact with people who were not going to treat her as someone whose past defined her entirely, and that she was, incidentally, going to continue regardless of his uncertainty. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "You are right," which was the thing she valued most about him. In arguments he was capable of saying it. She thought about that as she watched the snow. She thought about the specific quality of a person who argues honestly and concedes honestly and does not, in either mode, perform anything. She had not known that existed in the world she had been operating in, which was a world that ran on performance, performance of wealth, performance of contentment, performance of certainty by people who possessed none of it. She had performed constantly herself for years, and had called it dignity because that was the most useful name for it. But it had still been performance. She was performing less now. The Thursday sessions with Evanthea had moved into the middle weeks of the family's more complicated history, the parts that were not cleanly presentable, the decisions that had been made badly, and the consequences that had followed. Evanthea told these parts with the same unsparing directness she brought to everything, and Iseldra had understood that this was its own form of respect, to be given the whole of a history, not the curated version. She had asked Evanthea 2 weeks ago about her grandfather specifically, about what kind of man he had been in the fullness of it, not just the part that had produced the specific damage to her mother. Evanthea had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said that he had been a man of real capability and real failure, like most men, but that his particular failure had been the common one of measuring the cost of a choice by what it cost him personally, and not by what it cost the person with less power to refuse it. She had said that she had loved him because he was her father, and known he was wrong in this, and said nothing, and that the saying nothing was her own failure, which she did not intend to spend the rest of her life making excuses for. Iseldra had sat with that for a long time, the honesty of it and the weight of it, and the particular courage of a 70-year-old woman sitting in her morning room with good light and saying plainly what she had done wrong, without wrapping it in anything softer. She had thought about what it meant to be given that, to be trusted with someone's honest accounting of themselves. She had thought about how rarely that happened in the world, and how much it was worth when it did. December arrived with more snow and more cold, and the particular social intensification of the London season's final gathenings, before the city redistributed itself to the country for Christmas. Iseldra attended 3 of these events in the first week, each time with a slightly different experience of the room, not because the rooms changed, but because she did, infinitesimally, each time. She was becoming fluent in a language she had always been able to hear, but never before been fully permitted to speak, and fluency was coming the way it always came, through accumulated exposure and the gradual falling away of the effort it required. She was at an evening gathering at the Holborn House on a Tuesday when she saw Rosalind Pembridge. She had not expected her to be in London. She had assumed, from what Aldrich had said about the letter, that Rosalind was in Wiltshire with her family, managing the aftermath of a difficult autumn at a careful distance from the rooms that had contained it. But there she was, across the drawing room, in a pale dress, speaking to 2 women Iseldra didn't know. Iseldra did not approach immediately. She watched for a moment with the attention she brought to things she needed to understand before she moved in them. Rosalind was present in the room, but not fully occupying it. There was something held back, something that had not yet decided whether to trust the space she was in. She laughed at the right moments and directed the conversation with competence. But underneath the competence was a quality Iseldra recognized, because she had worn it herself for years. The quality of someone who has not yet confirmed that they are allowed to be here without it costing them something. She crossed the room. Rosalind saw her coming, and her expression moved through several things in rapid succession: recognition, uncertainty, and then something that settled into a kind of careful openness, as though she had decided in those 2 seconds that running the full calculation was less useful than simply seeing what happened. "Miss Beaumont," she said. "Miss Pembridge." Iseldra held her gaze steadily. "I am glad you are here." Rosalind looked at her. "Are you?" "Yes," Iseldra said, and meant it. Because Rosalind Pembridge being in this room, in this pale dress, after an autumn that had been done to her, rather than chosen by her, was a specific kind of courage. And Iseldra had decided some weeks ago that she was going to recognize courage when she saw it, in all the forms it took. They talked for 20 minutes, not about the engagement, not about Fulton, not about any of the machinery that had moved through both their lives in the past several months. They talked about Wiltshire, which Rosalind had described with a warmth that said she genuinely loved it, and about London in winter, and about a novel they had both apparently read in the autumn, which Rosalind had found overlong and Iseldra had found, contrarily, too brief. When they separated, Rosalind said, "I hope we will see each other again." "I expect we will," Iseldra said, and the expectation was genuine, which was itself a new thing, expecting the future to contain things worth having, without the qualifications she had always attached to that expectation before. She found Aldrich near the fireplace at the end of the room, which is where she usually found him at these events, not isolated exactly, but positioned at the edge of the central activity rather than within it. Watching the room with that quality of attention that had stopped alarming her, and begun to feel like a kind of steadiness she navigated by. He looked at her when she arrived beside him. "Rosalind Pembridge," he said. "We spoke?" "I know. I watched." He looked at the fire for a moment. "How was it?" "Better than either of us had planned for," she said. "Which is the best kind of thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without turning from the fire, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He turned then and looked at her with the open expression that had no armour in it, the one she had seen first in the sitting room at the Marchmonts, and that had become, over the past weeks, the face she associated most directly with him, not the public composure, not the assessment, but this, the real one. "I want you to come to the estate for Christmas," he said. "Not Grosvenor Square, the country estate. I am going for 2 weeks, and Evanthea is coming, and I want you there." He paused. "Not because of the Beaumont connection, or because it would be appropriate, or because it serves any arrangement, because I want you there specifically." She looked at him. The firelight moved between them. She thought about the estate, as he had described it to her. Over the course of their conversations, the north wing he had not entered since his father died. The grounds that were beautiful in winter, if you were willing to go out into the cold. The library that was the best room in the house, and that he had been avoiding for 3 years out of a grief he had not yet finished. She thought about what it meant to be invited into a place that a person had been protecting, and what it said about the person doing the inviting. She thought about well enough, and what it used to mean, and what it meant now. "Yes," she said, "I will come." He looked at her for a moment with something that was quiet and real, and did not need to be more than it was. "Good," he said, and turned back to the fire, and she stood beside him in the warmth of it, and felt the room around them with the particular fullness of someone who is no longer outside a thing looking in but inside it, genuinely occupying it with their full self. The 2 weeks before Christmas moved with the focused busyness of a life that had more in it than she was accustomed to managing. There were the Thursday sessions with Evanthea, which had arrived at the generation immediately before her mother's, and were therefore the most personally weighted and required the most careful attention. There were 2 more visits to Brook Street, where Cordelia was making the slow, Genuine work of rebuilding a version of herself that had not been in operation for 5 years, which was not fast and was not linear, and was sometimes, Iseldra could see, deeply uncomfortable, but which was real. There was correspondence with Hetty Marsh, who had sent a note saying that Corvin Leach had heard from his channels that Fulton had moved further from London than initially reported, and that the movement looked permanent. She read that note twice and felt something she had not expected to feel, not triumph, which was too loud for what it actually was, but a kind of settling, the absence of a weight that had been present for weeks. She packed for the country estate on a Thursday evening. Not much. She was still not a person who owned much, though that was beginning to change incrementally as she understood that acquiring things was not the same as being acquired by them, which had been a confusion she carried from the years of poverty, when things had felt like evidence of stability, and stability had always been one disaster away from gone. She sat on the edge of the bed in Portman Square with the half-packed bag, and looked at the room in the way she had been looking at it since she arrived, cataloguing it, taking inventory, checking that it was still real. It was still real. She thought about the girl who had pressed a gold dress with a borrowed flat iron and stood in a warped mirror and told herself well enough. She thought about her with something that was not quite pity, because the girl had been doing the right thing with what she had, which was all anyone could do, and the rightness of it deserved more than pity. She thought about her with something closer to the feeling she'd had looking at the portrait in Evanthia's corridor: recognition, continuity, the sense of a thread connecting then to now that did not break even in the places where it thinned. She finished packing. She went to the window one last time before she blew out the lamp. The street below was quiet in the snow, the lamplight on the white surface of it turning the whole of Portman Square into something that looked, briefly, like a room that had been prepared for something. Ready. Expectant. She was ready. Not in the way she had been ready before. Not the readiness of someone braced for impact. Not the readiness of someone managing their surface while protecting their interior. She was ready in the way that she had only recently understood was possible, open to what was coming, not because she had stopped being afraid of loss, but because she had learned, in the past 3 months, that she was someone who survived loss and built from it, and that this was not a vulnerability. It was the most durable thing about her. She blew out the lamp. She got into the carriage in the morning with one bag and the documents in her coat, and the quiet of a woman who knows where she is going. The road out of London opened up past Islington into the wider country, the snow-covered fields on either side, the sky low and white and full of the particular silence that winter carried in places where the city could no longer reach. Aldrich was already at the estate when she arrived. He came to the door himself, which she had come to understand was how he operated when something mattered to him. No performance, no delegation, simply presence. They stood in the doorway of the house for a moment, with the cold behind her and the warmth in front. "Welcome," he said, and it was such a plain word, such an unadorned and ordinary word, and it landed with the weight of everything it meant in this specific context, in this specific doorway, said by this specific person to someone who had spent most of her life arriving at places where welcome was conditional and temporary and attached to usefulness. She stepped inside. She stood in the entrance hall of the Ashworth country estate and looked at the staircase and the paintings and the high ceilings, and she felt the floor under her feet, and it was solid, and it was real, and it was not well enough. It was the beginning of what came after well enough. And what came after is a longer story. It is the story of the North Wing, and what she found when she went into it with him for the first time in spring, and what that cost him, and what it gave him, and what it meant for both of them. It is the story of Cordelia finding her way back to a version of herself that was better than the original, and Rosalind Pembridge making a choice in Wiltshire that nobody saw coming. It is the story of Evanthea, who lived to be 87 and attended 4 significant events in that time, and considered all of them adequately interesting. And it is the story of Iseldra Beaumont, who was mocked for her poverty until she became a duchess, and who would tell you, if you asked, that the Duchess was the smaller part of the story. The larger part was everything she had already been before the title arrived, the girl in the mended dress who walked into the room anyway. She was always the story. The title was just the room finally catching up to her. I want to say something to you before I go, and I want to say it as plainly as Iseldra would say it, because I think she has earned the right to set the tone. Some of you watching this have been mocked for what you don't have. Some of you have stood at the entrance of rooms, real rooms, or the rooms that exist in your career, your family, your relationships, and heard the laughter, and felt it land, and walked in anyway with your chin level, because there was no alternative that preserved your dignity. I see that. I know that walk. Iseldra's story is not a fantasy about titles and estates, though it is those things too. It is a story about what survives being diminished, about what a person builds from the wreckage of an inheritance that was withheld from them, about the particular kind of strength that does not announce itself because it has never needed to, it has always just been there, holding everything up from underneath. Tell me in the comments who you walked into the room for, who taught you to hold your chin level, what the room was, and whether they saw you coming. I read every comment, every single one. You are not talking into empty space here. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe so you are here when the next chapter opens, because Iseldra's new world has barely begun, and what is waiting in the north wing of that estate is going to change everything you thought you understood about who she is. Stay with us. She is just getting started.